How a simple plastic card turned Americans into credit addicts. Yes, today I'm going to tell you the incredible story of Visa. We all know that the United States lives on credit. Not only does the government live on credit, but the citizens also live on credit with this credit card system. But before telling you about the simple marketing operation that flooded the United States with cards of this style, a little aside. Since we, as Europeans, often talk about credit cards, what we generally use are debit cards. The difference is that a debit card takes money directly from your account, either immediately or at a later date, at the end of the month. But in both cases, you are only spending money you already have, so it is not a loan. In the United States, credit cards work differently. They are actual consumer loans. When an American uses their credit card, they are borrowing money from the bank to finance their purchase. And if he doesn't pay off his entire balance at the end of the month, he has to pay interest. But now that this distinction is clear, let's return to the story of the very first credit card in the United States. We are in 1958. The United States is experiencing an unprecedented period of economic growth. The middle class is expanding, and with it, the desire to buy new appliances like washing machines, televisions, refrigerators, and so on. But at the time, take out a consumer loan. It's not that simple. You had to make an appointment with your banker, discuss to get an agreement for a specific loan with a dedicated amount for a purchase at a specific store. That's for big purchases. For small purchases, it's usually the merchants themselves who extend credit. They note the customer's purchases and then send them a bill, usually at the end of each month. On the payment side, it's very standard. You either use cash or checks. So there were a few payment cards that existed, but they were limited to very specific contexts like gas stations, department stores, or restaurants with the Diners Club card, which is the closest thing to a credit card. But it's very limited to restaurants, mainly New York restaurants, and it has about 20,000 members. But you quickly see the limit of this type of system, since it's hard to imagine carrying around 50 cards to pay at 50 different merchants. And it's in this context that Bank of America, the largest bank in the United States at the time, was operating only in California. So, let me remind you that at that time, in the 1950s, American banks were limited to one state, so they couldn't do business in neighboring states. So, Bank of America at the time is a big bank on the scale of California. It's the biggest. It's still one of the largest on the scale of the United States because California is a big state, but it remains relatively small overall. And Bank of America decides to launch a marketing operation that has never been seen before in the banking world. This operation will later be named the drop, which can be translated to the parachute in French, and it involves sending a plastic card to 60,000 customers in the city of Fresno without them having requested it. It's of course a credit card, as you understood. These credit cards arrive on September 18th, 1958 in the mailboxes of customers, but the residents of Fresno at first don't really know how to use them. And in the bank's ad, which comes out the same day in the Fresno newspaper, it says it's quick, easy, and convenient. And you can pay for whatever you want, whether it's dinner at your favorite restaurant or a new rug for your living room. The principle is that you have a 25-day period to make your payment. The balance on the card is interest-free. And then you have an interest rate of 18%. So 18% might seem huge, and it is huge, since at the time, the inflation rate was around, I checked, about 3%. But that's what was practiced on department store credit cards. Typically, Sears at the time, so Bank of America is just adapting with this huge interest rate. So we obviously understand Bank of America's interest behind this. So why Fresno? It's a strategic choice. It's a medium-sized city in California located between San Francisco and Los Angeles with about 250,000 residents. And especially where 45% of households have an account with Bank of America. So the advantage of this credit card is that it offers a payment convenience compared to checks, especially checks at that time. You have to see it's extremely long. It's very manual, so it's complicated for both the customers, for merchants and for banks. Of course, it provides very easy access to credit since you have a limit between $300 and $500 at the time. So you don't need to negotiate every time with your banker. You have this limit set with the bank and you can make small purchases or larger ones. For merchants, the big advantage, of course, is that they no longer have to extend credit for small amounts to hundreds or thousands of people. Now it's the bank that takes care of it. On the bank side, it wins on both fronts. So few administrative fees, especially on the check side, and then more credit granted. And then especially customers who will be tempted to take out loans because it's so easy now. But for it to work, a crucial point at the beginning, of course, you need to build a network of merchants who agree to accept the card. So you have to go see the merchants. You have to convince them, etc. But what you need to realize is that credit cards back then were not at all what we see today. It's not automated. There's no chip or anything at all. There's not even a magnetic strip. There's absolutely nothing at all. There's no technology at all. It's really just a piece of plastic with a name and a number. And if you go to your merchant with your card to make a purchase, whether it's for groceries or a television, there's a set amount between $25 and $100 below which the merchant can accept the transaction without checking the credit. Then it's the bank's problem. And if the amount is above that, the merchant has to call Bank of America to see if the limit is sufficient. If there haven't been too many expenses in the meantime, yes, it sounds crazy, but there's no automation. We have to make a call for each transaction. And of course, the merchant has to pay a commission since it can attract new customers. And then there's this aspect of free credit, at least free for him. Of course, as we've seen, it's very expensive for the customer. They have to pay a 6% commission. The problem the bank has at the start is that it needs to attract merchants to encourage customers to get the card. And then on the other side, it needs to have customers to attract the merchants. And that's the incredible idea behind this drop, this parachuting of 60,000 credit cards into mailboxes. It's rather than recruiting customers 111 and then merchants 111, and the more customers you have, the more merchants you have, and vice versa, etc. We create 60,000 customers all at once, 60,000 credit cards all at once, and then we use that to recruit merchants. And it worked. Small merchants sign up quite easily, but not the big ones who already have their card, like Sears, for example. Refuse, but the small ones accept quite easily. And there's a story told by a former executive of Bank of America who recounts visiting a grocery store to convince the owner to accept the card, and the owner almost gets down on his knees saying, "But you're saving my life." And he shows them in the back room that he has 3 people managing 1,500 accounts each with credit amounts between $4, $12, $8, etc. Just small amounts. And for him, it's a huge paperwork hassle. Because remember, these merchants handle their credit themselves by jotting it down on little pieces of paper. And they have to send out thousands of invoices at the end of the month, so it's really extremely complicated for them. In the end, at the start, the fees are going to drop a lot later on. They're pretty happy to pay that 6. And at the time of the drop, there are already 300 merchants who have signed up. But above all, there are many others who say, well, once these credit cards are issued, no problem, we'll join you. So, this drop, we agree, it's a stroke of genius, but it also has its limits. Because the cards were sent to all Bank of America customers in Fresno, so all the customers have the same limit. And there, you can clearly see the problem. The people who created this card don't come from the credit world at all. They didn't even think about the risk. They said to themselves, usually in our consumer loans, we have a 4% default rate, and we're going to see the same thing here, except that the payment defaults start to pile up. But even if they start to worry a little, Bank of America sees after a few months that there are competitors starting to think about the same thing. There are actually just some stores that tell them, oh, we've been approached by such and such bank, etc., to potentially be part of another credit card network. So that puts pressure on Bank of America, who is simply going to say, well, we have payment issues. We have quite a few credits that are defaulting, but it's okay. We're going to ease up. We're going to move out of Fresno, and we're going to send this card to lots and lots of cities from California, and especially the big city, Los Angeles. In October 1959, so 13 months after the Fresno drop, Bank of America had already issued 2 million credit cards, and over 20,000 merchants had agreed to join the network. So, after this initial success, Bank of America is present with its credit cards in almost all of California. But the problems start to pile up, especially on the payment default side. The number of payment defaults skyrockets to 22% of the credits being in default, while the bank, as I mentioned, had only planned for 4%. We also have issues on the fraud side. Of course, the cards are being stolen. Thieves quickly realized that they could pay a bit like today with contactless payments, that they could pay below the limit, and that the merchant wasn't going to call the bank to check the credit, etc. So, all's piling up. And the bank estimated it had incurred losses of $8.8 million on that part. Credit, but if we take everything into account, including fraud, etc., it even rises to $20 million in losses, which at the time, in 1958, I remind you, was huge. But fortunately, the bank quickly learns from its mistakes. It will quickly distribute credit cards only to its good customers, to those who don't have credit issues. So the number of cards issued will go from about 2 million to a big million. But above all, what ended up being a somewhat disastrous launch, we agree, 20 million in losses, that's huge. At the time, it wasn't at all what was expected. It's almost a stroke of luck for Bank of America already, because starting in 1961, credit cards are going to become a profitable activity for the bank. But more importantly, all its competitors heard about those millions lost, all those defaults on payments, etc. They ultimately thought that credit cards weren't such a great idea after all, and they left Bank of America alone. So, until 1966, competitors will leave Bank of America a bit alone in the credit card arena. It will really be able to establish its grip on California. So, at the time, this drop of credit cards in Fresno went relatively unnoticed. but it marked the beginning of a revolution. It forever changed the way people consume in the United States. The credit card made credit consumption accessible to the entire American middle class. It really has become a habit. It has become part of American culture, for better or for worse. But I imagine you're starting to wonder, how did this American bank, how did this simple California credit card, only in 1966, and solely managed by Bank of America, it became the international company Visa, which we all know today as Visa, which is actually worth over $500 billion on the stock market. That's 70% more than Bank of America. Itself, well, the answer is as fascinating a story as the drop in Fresno that I will tell you about in my next video. I will explain to you how this American bank became the payment giant Visa. There you go. Thank you all. See you soon.